if we see those brackets, we know that it means that we can essentially use pretty much any type here. So it doesn't have to be user resource. But what this response entity does is it implements something in the HTTP protocol. Because here essentially we are working with the HTTP protocol. And in HTTP, you usually have, of course, you have a client, and you have a client on one side, and this client can be a browser. So a user that's going through your system through a browser, and you can have like an Android application. So somebody is going through this through some application on Android, iOS application. So somebody is going through this with an iOS application, and it can be anything. It can even be some program like Carl, or it can be Postman. So the clients can be a lot of things, but I think the most common one is a browser. So let's imagine somebody is going through your application, using your application through a browser. This other component in the HTTP protocol is a server. So a server is the thing that is providing the content. So if we imagine, like in our local case, we have iTax. So iTax runs on some server within KRA's like internal systems. Maybe they are renting it from AWS in some other country, or they have them in the basement of that building. So they have servers. They have some physical servers somewhere. So the client is trying to access things from that server, like for instance, items. This could also be like if you're doing a Google search, of course, if you're accessing Google from your browser, you'll be accessing Google's servers. So the server is the machine that's providing the content for you. But I'm sure with that, I'm preaching to the choir. So this client-server communication, it happens through a HTTP request. So the client sends a HTTP request. So your client sends HTTP request, and the server, of course, the server receives this HTTP request, and it returns, so the server returns HTTP response as a result. So you get a HTTP request from the client, from this browser, and the server, of course, will receive that HTTP request, and then it will process that request and return a HTTP response. So that's how the communication happens. So an example of that would be something like so you're trying to, let's imagine you're trying to search for hotels. So so get hotels in your location. So maybe you can say where you are. So the server will receive this, process it, and then it will return a response, and the response will have a list of hotels. So where does response entity come in? So response entity represents this response from the server. So when you want to communicate back to the client application, like the browser or a mobile application, whichever thing that's trying to access a resource from your server, you return the response and you wrap the response in a response entity. So that is what this object is for. So you can think of it as response entity. A response entity is a representation of the HTTP response. So it wraps the HTTP response presentation. So when you want to represent a HTTP response using Spring Boot, you use the response entity. That forms your HTTP response. And the request that we're talking about, the request here that's from the client, it's this. This is, and so that's why we're using this annotation, request body, because this is what the client is sending us. Okay. Just to emphasize it a bit, if we go to the documentation for this, because this is, everything is code, so you can always read it and see what's happening. You'd see response entity forms a HTTP entity. We'll ignore that, but it's a class. It's a generic class. It even has the T parameterized type. And the documentation says that, so this is an extension of HTTP that HTTP entity that adds a HTTP status code used in that you can ignore as template, as well as controller methods. Anything here that we can use. Okay, so the documentation is not very explicit as my explanation, but essentially it's basically the response from the server. It's a way of representing the response that you're sending as the server. Yeah, so this HTTP entity, they're saying represents an HTTP request or response entity consisting of headers and bodies and so on. So if you know about the HTTP protocol, when a server is communicating back to the client, you can communicate back to the client using status codes. Status codes are like 300, 301, 400, 500. And those status codes will allow the client to understand what's happening in a more concise way. So like if you respond with a 500, this means something went wrong. So this is internal server error. So this is telling the client, it's not your fault, something bad happened on the server. We were not able to process a request. So something like 4, which is very popular, is not found. So the thing you're looking for is not on this server. So these hotels that you're looking for are not present. So these status codes are part of it, but also you can send messages, plain messages, like you could say an error occurred. It can be part of your response. On top of that, so you can combine. So yeah, so you can send status codes like 500, 404. You can send messages like an error occurred or internal server error or whatever. But also you can send back data. And data would be like the list of hotels we're talking about. So all of these, you can put them together, the status code, the message, and the data. And if you put all of those together, they would form the HTTP response. And the mapping for the HTTP response within Spring Boot is response entity. So whenever you see response entity, just imagine HTTP response. And the parameterized type represents the data. The status code is already built into the HTTP response. So, for instance, response data here that we are sending back is the user resource. So that's what we are passing as the parameterized type. And when we return the response, this is the status code. This can also be not found here. It can also be internal server error. It can be multiple status codes. So for us, we're using status code created, which is 201, telling the client that the resource they are trying to create into the server was actually persisted or saved. But the data we are sending is this user resource. So you see, we are passing the status code and the data separately. I don't know if that explains it.
Oh, yeah.
It's clear now.